and I am Vice President of Community Engagement and Nonprofit Finance Fund. We are thrilled to be able to be sharing our 2025 State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey findings with you all today. This is the 10th survey that NFF has conducted over a period of 16 years. For those of you who may be familiar, the State of the Sector Survey is a widely cited barometer of how nonprofits are faring in today's changing environment and the investments needed to secure their long-term futures. This collective data set is one of the largest of its kind and is used by many across the sector to advocate for meaningful changes across philanthropy, government, and other community leaders for nonprofits who are doing this important work in the community right now. The findings we're going to share today really speak to the title of our report this year, Essential, Enduring, and Under Strain, the Nonprofit Sector's Strength and Struggle in a Shifty Landscape. Next slide, please. Before we get started, would love to just see for folks on this call, we're going to be sharing a lot of data. We wanted to capture some data today around what your theme song might be for this year. And I'm going to ask Michaela to run our poll for us right now. Would love to get a little interaction. What is your theme song this year for your organization? All I Need is a Miracle, Living on a Prayer, Ain't No Stopping Us Now, or I Will Survive? Folks probably are really feeling this week. And we can see it all coming in. Great. We're at 70% participation. We can end the poll. And let's share the results, Michaela. We're so happy to share that I Will Survive is the leading song. And we are really excited that folks are feeling that energy, although we definitely see those that are living on a prayer. So hopefully that's a fun start to us kicking off today. And what we will be covering, hopefully, will be some data that helps support the stories that you all are telling. We're going to be doing an introduction and survey overview for you all today. We're going to be going over the key themes of the data this year, which includes the current environment nonprofits are navigating, financial health of the sector, experiences with funders, and nonprofit staff dynamics. And then we're going to be closing off with recommendations for funders and nonprofits, as well as a short question and answer series. We will name that today's webinar is a webinar setting. And if you would like to submit a question for NFF as you are seeing the data come in, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and submit your question. Our team will be reviewing those questions and will be either answering them at the end if we can theme some of them. And if you don't see it answered at the end, we will have your email address and we can reply to you and share the findings there. Next slide. Nonprofit Finance Fund, for those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, national nonprofit community development financial institution and service organization that provides capital, financial consulting, and advocacy for the nonprofit sector, really for the purpose of helping nonprofits to advance community wealth and well-being. Go on to the next slide. We really want to thank our partners and our sponsors this year. You can see those sponsors here that have really enabled us to provide this survey and this data set and of the findings that you're going to be hearing today. Thank you to our partnership with Eviteris, who is going to be one of our presenters today, as well as our survey advisor, Ambit 360 Consulting. Thank you so much to all of our local and national outreach partners. Without you all helping to get the word out, we would not have been able to get the responses that we did to tell this story. And most importantly, the responding organizations who we hope that you see yourselves in the story today. And thank you so much for trusting us and sharing your data with us to be able to tell the story. Can we go to the next slide? Just a little bit about this report and this survey that we did this year. Our goals around the survey are always to be able to measure the financial health, the funding, and the operational landscape of of US nonprofits. We were looking at fiscal year 2024, given that that was the last completed fiscal year at the time of this survey, and really also the anticipated experiences for 2025, as this survey opened on January 30th and was open for 6 weeks until March 14th. And as many of you on this call know, this was just weeks after the first executive orders launched. And so we know that that was what was top of mind for folks as they responded to this survey. Our target population for this, we used a convenient sample, just simply means that we looked at all of the organizations that responded to this survey, and everyone had a chance to respond if they were able to access that link. And we had specific outreach partners and specific geographies. So you will see that there is a heavier rate of participation in these areas that you can see listed here: California, Hawaii, Greater Philadelphia, Dallas, Fort Worth, New York City, and Georgia. There were 63 questions in the survey, and we were thrilled to see that we had 2,206 valid responses, which for us is going to tell a really great story of the sector, and you'll be hearing more about that today, about who comprised those responses. Can we go to the next slide, please? Following this launch of the national findings, you can expect more from NFF over this year, so please sign up for our emails to get the latest updates. We will be having deeper analysis of the data on specific themes that we'll be sharing. In the fall, we'll be releasing presentations and analyses on the geographic areas where we have partnerships: California, Hawaii, Greater Philadelphia, Dallas, Fort Worth, New York City, and Georgia. And most excitingly, this year, we are so excited to be able to provide a publicly accessible data analyzer that will be available for anyone to come in and see some of the most important data sets that data questions that we get asked, and be able to analyze themselves by budget size, by state. And it's really thanks to a partnership with your part-time controller. We'll be able to provide that on our website this year. And so sign up for our emails and you will be able to see that. Today's speakers, I am so excited to share with you all, the folks that have been on the front lines of this survey and looking at the data, to share with you our findings today. Elise Miller, Senior Director of Community Engagement and Nonprofit Finance Fund, who was a lead author; Jennifer Talansky, Vice President of Marketing Communications for NFF, who was a lead author; and Dr. Shakari Byerly, who's a managing partner at Eviteris and was our partner on our survey administration. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Byerly to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Annie. It's truly a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm Dr. Shakari Byerly. I'm Managing Partner and Director of Polling and Research at Eviteris. I want to thank NFF for trusting Eviteris with this important work of administering the survey to uplift and to amplify the voices of nonprofit organizations across the country through such an impactful survey. I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge my team at Eviteris, including CEO Rodrigo Byerly, President Raquel Beltran, polling analyst Noah Marcotte, and associate data analyst Dominique McDonald for their expert contributions in executing the survey and this important work. I'd like to first start by setting the table and providing a snapshot of who responded to the survey. On this slide, you will see that we captured the responses of a range of organizations from various sample sizes. The report represents the voices of 2,206 leaders across 48 states. And we deeply appreciate each organization that raised their voice to create this shared story about the nonprofit sector. As you'll see on this slide, the responses represent organizations across budget sizes from $50,000 to over $20 million. You can also see here that 1 in 5, or 18% of respondents, had budgets between $2 million to $5 million, and 22% had budgets under $500,000. As you click over it, we'll display also the key areas of work for organizations. And so the respondents represent a wide range of areas of contributions. The largest, representing 35% of respondents, were working in human services. We also want to acknowledge, as Annie stated earlier, the strong overrepresentation from geographies where NFF had outreach partners, with most of the responses coming from California, followed by Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and New York. Now, we'd love to know what part of the country today's participants on this call are coming from. So Michaela is going to help us run a poll. So join in and let us know where you're calling in from. In what region of the U.S. are you located? Is it the Midwest, the Northeast, the South, the West, or U.S. territory? Wow. So we're happy to see both the Northeast and the West well represented, with each about a third of participants calling in today. But shout out also to those in the Midwest and the South. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Let's go on through more of the background of our survey respondents. We noted that participants were serving in a variety of geographic contexts. And it's important to note on this slide that participants were able to select multiple geographies in which they were serving communities. More than a third, or 67%, were serving urban areas, while 47% were serving rural areas. 43 came from organizations that were serving in suburban context. We also were able to capture responses from organizations that are led by a diverse range of leaders. And so on the right side of the slide, you'll see that 3 and 5 identified as non-Hispanic white, but we were also able to capture responses from organizations that were led by African American nonprofit leaders, 18%. Those who identified as Hispanic or Latine, 11%, 6% had an Asian American leader, 2% American Indian or Alaskan Native, 2% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 1% Middle Eastern, and 4% of some other identification. If you have ever gone, on the next slide, to a health clinic, a free health clinic, dropped off your child at an after-school program, joined a local arts event, or turned to a food pantry in a tough moment, you felt some of the nonprofit magic. Nonprofits are everywhere. They're feeding us, they're housing us, they're teaching us, they're nurturing our creativity and helping us to heal. They are community centers. They're theaters, shelters, museums, and schools that help us live a full, connected life. They're working behind the scenes, making a big impact, often with few resources. And they're often stepping in to fill basic needs where our public systems are failing us. The over 200, the 2,200 organizations that responded to the survey really offer us a snapshot of what community infrastructure looks like. It's made up of 1.8 million US nonprofits. As community infrastructure, these organizations are serving communities, they're employing people in communities, and they're standing up for communities. Similar to the roads and power lines, they are often in the background, but they're always vital to making sure our communities are safe, that they're joyful, and they're whole. When we invest in that kind of infrastructure, everyone wins. Let me tell you a bit more of what I mean in that regard. And really, the words of our participants speak best. And you'll see two of the quotes on the slide here. When the world gets hard, our nonprofits show up. We have seen globally over the past several years, nonprofits show up and serve in some of the most difficult circumstances, from bringing first responders during COVID-19 to the recent and devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. They're there for our communities, but they don't just serve those communities, they are those communities. 32% of leaders of responding organizations have lived experience that's representative of the people that they serve. 51% solicited and acted on community feedback about their services and how they could best serve their communities. On the next slide, we've provided some additional feedback directly in the words of respondents. I'll leave those for you to review, but in terms of their contributions economically, the data really shows the extent to which nonprofits are serving as economic engines for the communities in which they're rooted. The nonprofits in our survey alone employed more than 84,000 full-time and 31,000 part-time staff in 2024. Over half spent more than $500,000 on salaries, and more than 1 in 10 spent over $5 million in wages. These wages flow back into communities, into small businesses, and local life. In addition, over 44% spent more than $100,000 on local vendors when spending for their organization. Field-wide data from Independent Sector in 2024 paints a fuller picture. We know from that work nationally that nonprofits employ over 10% of the U.S. private workforce. That's 12.5 million people, and spend more than 670 billion on wages, with an additional 65 billion going to federal payroll taxes. They're the third largest private sector employer in the country, contributing more than $1.4 trillion to the economy each year. Nonprofits are responsible for millions of jobs and billions in local spending. Beyond the dollars, however, they also provide job training, education, childcare, and healthcare that fundamentally shifts capacity and the economy of entire communities. I'll just read the comment in the third box here at the bottom of the slide from one of our human services nonprofits in Oregon. In their words, we employ close to 200 people in our area and spent most of our $12 million budget on housing expenses, groceries, and activities for people we support. All of these dollars are kept local. Nonprofits are also standing up for the communities that they serve. As a part of the community infrastructure, they are addressing the pressing needs of the community, particularly those without access. 62% of survey respondents indicated that they have a major focus on building community wealth and well-being. In addition, over half indicate that they help address economic inequality, and 4 in 10 are working to advance racial equity. Not shown in the listing here, but important to uplift, 45% also indicated that they are engaged in advocacy and policy work in 2024, and 29% are working to increase civic engagement. Nonprofits are indeed standing up to demand better for their community. With that, I'm now going to pass the mic to Elise Miller from NFF, who will share what we learned about how the sector is faring.
Thanks so much, Dr. Byerly. Great to be here, and I'm excited to walk through what we are learning and what we are seeing about this really important infrastructure that Dr. Byerly talked about. So one of the things we see loud and clear in the survey is how nonprofits are the infrastructure that make our community run. They're like roads and like power lines, as we said. And the big takeaway from the next few slides is that this infrastructure is in trouble in many ways, and really needs our collective focus and care. I'll say this isn't an entirely new story. We conducted the State of the Sector survey 10 times since 2009. And underfunding, restrictive funding practices, late government payments have really created a chronic, fragile nonprofit financial picture that we've heard about survey after survey. There was a positive disruption to this trend that we saw in the early 2020s when we did our 2022 survey, when the pandemic and our country's racial reckoning really prompted more flexible funding and major public and private investments into our community infrastructure. We saw funders respond to crisis by being more trusting and nimble. And we saw nonprofits respond with creativity, with resilience. And what we saw in our 2022 survey data was that by the end of 2021, a lot of nonprofits actually reported stronger financial footing. This year's survey data, though, shows that many of those gains didn't last. And in 2025, we see nonprofits close to reaching a breaking point. So 2025 survey data really shines light on 3 colliding crises that we see nonprofits facing and we see come up in the data in many ways. And I wanted to share this up front because it's both deeply connected with, but also impacting all of the data we'll go through when we talk about the health of the nonprofit sector. So first, inflation is huge in the backdrop for nonprofits today. In fact, 86% of respondents said that high costs due to inflation affected their organizations and clients in 2024. From rent to insurance to supplies, expenses have really been climbing across the board, and policy decisions are intensifying the pressure. Inflation, of course, also impacts nonprofit staff and how far their salaries stretch, and the same for the broader communities they serve. Second crisis we see, expected massive cuts in government funding in 2025 and beyond, coupled with chronic funding delays, which are threatening to disrupt essential services. Among respondents with nonprofit funding, 84% expect cuts as a consequence of 2024 election results. 65% anticipate those cuts bigger than 10% of their government revenue. This is massive, especially when we consider the significant flows of government funding into nonprofits that have always supported our sector to do what it does best, to serve. At the time of the survey in early 2025, so January to March 2025, nonprofits anticipated that these kinds of cuts would result in paused programs, in hiring freezes, fewer services, challenges paying bills. And we know that since that time, many of those things have begun to happen for nonprofits. And finally, demand for services is ballooning. We've heard this also in almost every survey we've done, but it's particularly dramatic in the face of rising costs and government funding cuts. In this year's survey, 85% of respondents expect that their demand for their services will increase in 2025. Many already couldn't keep up with the demand in 2024, but expect it to get worse in the year ahead. I'll note these aren't isolated problems. We know this. They feed into each other in many ways, really creating a cycle of strain that we see and continue to see rippling across nonprofits, their staff, and their communities. Connected with this backdrop and what we can see on this slide, we know that a number of recent events are also having an impact on nonprofits. We asked respondents how, if at all, a series of events may have impacted their organizations and their clients. And the graph here shows the percentage of organizations that said that each event had an impact. So the darker blue bar on the left really indicates a great deal of impact for an organization and their clients, with the lighter blue bar on the right indicating some impact. We see on this slides, as the main takeaway, the events that most impacted nonprofits and their clients were, as I mentioned, high costs due to inflation, followed by the 2024 federal election, impacting 74% of organizations and their clients. Changes in immigration laws and policies and declining commitment to DEI initiatives also impacted more than half of respondents. We also saw in the data that these events impact different types of organizations and their experiences in very different ways. So for example, if we look at the general pullback from DEI, which I mentioned, 57% of white-led organizations reported this impacting them, while 71% of organizations led by people of color reported impact. 28% of white-led organizations reported impact from politically or racially motivated violence or threats, compared with 47% of organizations led by people of color. Now, the headlines will change here, but we know that community-serving organizations are continuing to be impacted by a number of these events, as well as many new ones. We will get into in a moment what this means from a financial lens, but also wanted to share a bit of what we learned about what communities nonprofits are serving are navigating. So we asked organizations what are the top 3 critical needs in the communities they serve, and this graph is what they shared. Across the country, affordable housing rose to the top, with nearly 4 in 10 respondents, and I'll say from rural areas of Iowa to dense urban areas of New York City, naming it as a top community need. Right behind housing, respondents identified financial security, youth programs, and access to mental and behavioral health care as top needs. We know none of these exist in isolation, of course. Many are directly intertwined, with nonprofits really providing that infrastructure, homes, education, mental health clinics to address them. So amidst this landscape, what do we see when it comes to financial health? Nonprofits are doing everything they can to stay afloat, but the financial systems meant to support them are often adding pressure, not relief. Whether working in arts or human services in California or North Carolina or Puerto Rico, with large or small budgets, we see many of the same trends hold true and a generally precarious financial footing across the sector. Costs are rising, as I mentioned, but it also appears that funding is not keeping up. And the result is that surpluses, which we know are essential for nonprofits, just as they are for businesses, are becoming harder to attain. We know nonprofits need surpluses to innovate, to expand their service hours, to fix broken heating systems, and that deficits often do the opposite, diminishing an organization's ability to adapt or worse, stay afloat. So what do we see in the data? The key takeaway here is that we see a startling percentage, 36% of respondents reporting an operating deficit in 2024. This is a higher percentage than we've seen over the past 10 years of our survey data, and even going back to our 2009 survey, right after the recession. This chart shows that surplus deficit data over the last 4 NFF surveys, from fiscal years 2014 to 2024. The green bars show the percentage of organizations reporting a surplus, the blue bar, break-even results, and the red bar, the percentage reporting deficits. And as I mentioned, in 2024, we see the highest percentage of deficits and the lowest percentage reporting surpluses. The data here comes from different organizations each year. But when we look at repeat respondents, those that took the survey over time, we see that these trends hold. And we see this situation in an even more stark way. There were 163 organizations that took our surveys in both 2022 and 2025. And we can track these organizations to see how their direct financial picture changed. 13% reported deficits in 2021. In 2024, that number was 37%, 24 percentage points higher. We're curious if this experience resonates with those joining today. And we wanted to do a quick poll to see if you and your peers have encountered these challenges as well. So you'll see on the screen, do you think surpluses are harder to attain now than 2 years ago? Yes, this is the case for me and my peers. Somewhat for some organizations. No, it feels similar to other moments we've experienced.
I think we're just waiting for Michaela to run the poll. I don't see it. Great, thank you.
Great. So everybody can see this here. It sounds like this resonates. We have 66% saying it feels harder to attain surpluses now than 2 years ago, with 4% saying no, it seems similar to other moments. Thank you for that. Moving on, we also look at months of cash in survey results, indicating how well an organization can weather crises and invest in opportunities. A proxy for really how long an organization can operate with what it has today, the cash it has today. The key takeaway here, over half, 52% of nonprofit respondents have less than 3 months of cash on hand for operating. We'll see here 10% had less than a month of cash on hand, meaning if their revenue suddenly stopped, they couldn't stay afloat for a month. You may know from best practice in personal finance, many suggest having 6 months of cash on hand to provide a cushion, for example, if your income changes dramatically. The nonprofit sector is no different, but getting there can be nearly impossible for some organizations. And what we see is that only about a third of organizations report 6 or more months of cash, the lowest percentage we've seen in the past 10 years of our survey data. On a positive note, we did see that 66% of respondents, more than we saw in 2022, reported having reserve funds designated for emergencies or opportunities. While we don't know the magnitude of these funds, just having these funds is a good sign. But we also saw that access to reserves isn't evenly distributed. So for example, just 50% of Black-led organizations and 47% of those with annual budgets under $250,000 reported having reserves. As we see from this data, our communities are navigating a lot, and our community infrastructure is hurting. Next, though, we want to take a look at some of what is impacting this, and then importantly, we'll get into what can we all do about it. I will keep us moving here. Most nonprofits, as we may all know and feel, depend on government and foundation funding to serve their communities. There are other revenue sources, but a majority of nonprofits rely on government and foundation funding. In our survey, more than 70% said that they receive money from federal, state, or local government, and 81% receive funding from foundations. And one of our questions, our key questions in developing this survey, based on what we've been hearing from organizations, clients, and many others, was about how funder practices may have changed over the past few years, from during the pandemic to afterward right now. So starting with foundation funding, during the pandemic and racial reckoning, we know many foundations changed how they worked. They leaned into principles of trust-based philanthropy. They offered more unrestricted funds, streamlined paperwork, dispersed grants more quickly. And in our last survey in 2022, 57% of respondents told us that funders had become more flexible. This chart here is from our 2025 survey. And what we see as the takeaway is that there has been some mixed progress. Some positive gains from how foundations funded during the pandemic and calls for racial justice. Some of those gains are continuing. Others have been pulled back. So what this chart does is looks at changes in foundation funder practices since late 2022. We asked about a lot of different changes. We're highlighting a few here. Practices such as grant restrictions and multi-year giving. The solid lines, if you look to the right on this chart, represent more supportive funder practices, with the dashed lines to the left representing less supportive funder practices. So for example, if we look at the blue bar at the top, we see that 40% of respondents said that foundation funding grants had become less restrictive since 2022, a really positive step forward, whereas 21% said that funders have become more restrictive. We also got a glimpse in qualitative responses of what unrestricted funding is allowing organizations to do. So as one respondent in Oregon, a lot of mention of Oregon, shout out to Oregon today, shared, for example, restructuring our financial model to increase unrestricted funds allowed us to move our ED executive director position from part-time to full-time. If we look back at the chart to the left, we can see some other trends. Concerning is the gray bar here. Grants on average have gotten ... At the same time that organizations are navigating rising costs and the pullback of government funding, we see that nearly half reported average grant sizes have shrunk since 2022, with only 13% saying they had gotten larger. We also see in the purple 30% of organizations reporting that wait times to learn about receiving a grant have gotten longer, while 9% say they have gotten shorter. On the government funding side, we see a continuation of longstanding challenges, delayed payments and low cost coverage, at the same time that, as I mentioned earlier, federal cuts are pulling back support for critical services. There were nearly 1,500 organizations who reported having some form of government funding, and we asked them what indirect rate they were typically allowed to charge. The key takeaway that we see in this graph on the left is that 70% of respondents said they could only charge an indirect rate, which covers things like human resources, information technology, rent, really critical to running an organization. We saw that 70% had an indirect cost rate of 10% or less. This is a rate that the federal OMB guidance last year acknowledged as insufficient to run a healthy organization. Another key takeaway here related to government funding, not only is government funding rarely covering what it takes to deliver services, but payment is also not coming in on time, sometimes months, even years late. The red and pink slices in this pie chart here show that more than half of organizations are typically paid late by government, with 11% reporting average delays longer than 3 months. At best, organizations lucky enough to have access to reserves may be dipping into them to cover delays. For many, what do these delays mean in reality? We see paused programs and we see delayed payments to vendors or to staff, all really having a rippling effect to impact communities and the broader economy. While some of the dynamics of government funding have been longstanding, layered onto this picture are now major pullbacks of funding, either already underway or expected. As I stated earlier, 84% of respondents expect their government funding to go down as a result of the election, and we heard stories of this from arts to healthcare to community development. With the scale of reduction, many are expecting or have already begun to freeze hiring, to lay off staff, to pause programs, or shut down services. I've put on the screen what a couple of respondents shared about this, what they are preparing for, and how they are responding. Stories which may sound familiar to many of you. As one housing organization in Maryland shared, we receive federal funding, so we are preparing for what that means for our current award, which seems frozen, and any future awards. We are also talking about the ways federal actions will negatively impact our clients and are forming or deepening relationships with other service providers so we can make appropriate referrals and ease the process in any way we can. So we've gone through a lot. The state of our infrastructure, the health of our communities, but what about the faces behind it all? The staff, many of you working tirelessly to show up, to stand tall for our communities, our economy, our planet. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jen now to dive in here.
Thank you, Elise, and hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. So we saw from the slides that have been shared that many nonprofits are running on empty. Too many of their workers are as well. Nonprofit workers are amazing and committed, but commitment alone does not pay for rent and groceries. Living wages do. To give a sense of how we thought about living wage, and we provided this link on the survey as well, we looked at the MIT living wage calculator, and this is as an example of what a living wage is. If we look at a single adult living in LA County with no children to support, they would need to make $27.81 an hour to have a living wage, which translates to something over $57,000 a year. In Philadelphia, that same single adult who's only supporting themselves needs to make over $48,000 a year. And of course, those numbers go up with any children or other dependents that a family member, that a worker needs to support. Only 41% of organizations say that they're able to pay all full-time staff a living wage. We also looked at smaller budget organizations, which is not data that's represented on this slide, but we looked at organizations with budgets of $250,000 or less a year. Just over a quarter of them, 28%, can pay all full-time staff a living wage. 68% of survey respondents said that the local cost of living is a top management challenge. Not surprisingly, organizations cited inflation and insufficient funding as the primary barriers to paying a living wage. We also asked in the survey about a detailed list of benefits that nonprofits make available to staff. Here we've highlighted just a couple of them. You can see the more detailed information on our website if you'd like to see the full list at nfs.org. Most nonprofits offer some staff benefits, but there are large gaps in coverage, especially, again, for respondents with smaller budgets. Only 2/3 of organizations offer health insurance, which is really the most critical benefit in this country. And that number is dramatically lower, just 12%, among organizations with budgets less than $250,000 per year. 54% of nonprofits surveyed offered retirement fund contributions to employees. That number drops to just 10% for organizations with budgets less than $250,000. So it is a challenge to offer these benefits to workers that are really critical to their current and future prosperity and health. Next slide. So what is this leading to? It's leading to staff burnout and staffing shortages. We've represented here in the graph all respondents who said these issues are a major or minor challenge for their organization. Major challenge is in dark blue on the left, minor challenge is in light blue on the right. The key takeaway here is that with the exception of providing for staff wellness options like working from home or flexible hours, all of these staff management challenges are an issue for the majority of respondents, finding staff with the right skill sets, staff and CEO burnout, and so on. Employing enough staff for programs and for administration are the most frequently noted challenge. And with costs rising faster than funding and the pullback of government funding, many struggle to raise salaries or fill critical vacancies, especially when there's a high cost of living where their organization is located. At the same time, organizations are calling out how important it is to center organizational culture and care. They're working to curb burnout by trying to keep workloads manageable, implementing mental health supports, and spreading the work across their teams. We got a lot of really rich information in some of the comments that people provided, and we've included one here. We prioritize the well-being of our team by centering self-care and recognizing when to cancel, pause, or scale back programming to prevent burnout. Slide. So now we're getting into what can we all do about this. So this is a story that is both old and new. We see many of the same issues that we have often seen, but with many of them exacerbated by the return to more restrictive practices and less funding after everything reverted to the norm after the pandemic and racial reckoning funding went away. And the issues are also exacerbated by the crisis we are in right now. The major cuts to federal funding, plus the turmoil created by policy changes, are really creating an existential threat for the sector. Some of the recommendations we make are going to feel like things that have been said many times before. Others are responsive to this time that we're in. In all cases, we urge everyone to say to themselves, what is at least one thing that I can do to enact these? How can I make sure that nonprofits, which are really as vital to our country's infrastructure as the power grid, are still around to provide healthcare for us, to feed us, to provide childcare while we're at work, and so much more. So on the next slide, we see the first of the three themes that we've bucketed our recommendations in. But the first and most important thing to say is we really need to work collaboratively to get through this. Nonprofits can't do this alone. Funders can't do this alone. We are all on the same team and support each other. So our first bucket is be adaptive, creative, and brave to meet the moment. On the funder side, please advocate internally to increase your payout percentage. You don't have to decide now that it will be forever, and we all know it will not fill the gaps left by federal funding cuts. But it could mean the difference between organizations folding or staying open to serve families. And please again enact all of the amazing flexibility that you so nimbly applied during the COVID pandemic to pay quicker and make the administrative burden lighter on nonprofit staff. We know it's not easy to get everyone at your entity, at your institution on board to make these changes. You all have a critical role to play in being an internal advocate for these good practices. Your voices are important in making change happen. And now for nonprofits. Nonprofits, now is the time to flex your planning muscles. We know this is not the fun stuff, but it's so necessary even right now. We have tools on our website in the Learn Fundamentals area, and if somebody can please put those in the chat from Team NFF, those tools will help you if you want them for things like planning different budget scenarios, understanding and planning for your cash flow situation. For the scenario planning, this will prepare you if you need to make big decisions quickly, including if you have to make tough decisions about prioritizing programs. Base your scenarios on a few of the most likely potential outcomes. Could be something like if inflation continues, if your government grant ends, or if more people show up for your programs. The next slide, we get to our next bucket, which is acknowledge and invest in what it truly takes to do the important mission work. People hear the word nonprofit and they often think, oh, that's a charity, money doesn't matter. That's a false narrative. And you can think about it like this. Nonprofits need to pay for things just like we do in our personal lives. So if the heat in your house stops working in the winter, you've got to fix it. And if you don't have the money to fix it, you're either going to be very cold, perhaps dangerously so, or you're going to have to find someplace else to stay. When a nonprofit's heater breaks, as wonderful as it would be if people gave them a heater for free, folks don't do that. They've got to pay for it, just like we do. And they've got to have money to do that. Not to mention they've got to pay for rent, salaries, they've got to pay local vendors. They need money to cover all of these day-to-day and emergency needs like a broken heater, or else vital community programs go away. So let's talk about what we can all do. On the funder side, funders, ask your grantees, what do you really need? What do you really need? What is your full cost budget? So that when they're applying for a grant, they're really including what they need to meet their needs. In addition to really paying at a rate that lets nonprofits provide a living wage, which we talked about earlier, for the staff doing the work, funding full cost also really lets organizations do things like keep their building safe, pay for a broken heater, upgrade outdated technology to keep data safe in this era, build reserves, and so much more. And also, please advocate internally at your foundation for why unrestricted funds, general operating funds, or multi-year funding for nonprofits will really help them to better fulfill their missions. And the mission work that is so critical on all sides of the nonprofit sector. It allows organizations to spend less time fundraising and more time delivering services to communities. And it gives them the space to know that they can hire staff to run a multi-year program. Nonprofits, this is an important one for you too. Calculate and advocate for your full cost, what it really takes to do your work. Consider your unfunded expenses, those that are not currently accounted for, but are really part of the work that you do, often with sweat equity. Rather than presenting a budget you think a funder will find palatable, present what you really need to be financially healthy to meet the changing needs of your communities. And also, make the case, make clear the full community impact of dollars invested in your organization. Be explicit about how what you do and the cost required to do it directly translates to programmatic and economic benefits for your community. Articulate what will be lost in the community if the funding you receive doesn't cover full costs. And on the next slide, we get to our third and final bucket, collaborate as a system. Nonprofits, staff, communities, we are all operating as an interconnected ecosystem, and we can lean into opportunities to work together and support one another. Funders, fund systems change work, advocacy, movement building, and the grassroots organizations that are often leading it. This may mean letting go of expectations about immediately countable outputs. These are investments in a better future. And leverage your networks to make introductions. 1/4 of respondents named connections to other funders as a top need. Nonprofits, reach out to others that do similar work or that are located in your neighborhood to share information, to see if there are shared needs, and to tell your story together to influence funders or policymakers. Your collective voice is so much stronger and louder, and therefore more likely to be heard than just one voice alone. And share and leverage resources. Are there ways you can share operational resources with trusted partners, things like accounting or marketing or legal support? And support each other as leaders. This is a really hard time. It's a challenging time to navigate. Connect with each other. Mutual support can really help keep leaders resilient in challenging times and give them that little extra boost of energy. Finally, for everyone, extend grace to yourself and to others. For funders and nonprofits, you may not be able to accomplish everything you aspire to right now. But if you're planning and you're acting with good intentions, then trust that you are making the most informed decisions you can. Be compassionate, be kind with yourself during this time of heightened stress and fatigue, and focus really your incredible energy on supporting your community, your team, and your peers. We are so grateful for everything that you do. On the next slide, before I hand it back off to Annie Chang, I want to leave you with these 2 quotes that demonstrate how nonprofits are taking some of the steps that we recommend. I'm going to read to you just one of them. We are working to ensure that our cash flow and budget are stable for the year and that we can honor the commitments we've made for work to do and to staff and our community. We are scenario planning and supporting our community, especially those most impacted, digging into our values and focusing on our important work. We are also advocating like crazy with our elected officials and for local legislation that strengthens our community. Annie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen and Elise and Dr. Byerly, for going over these important and timely findings. We have just a couple questions that we want to answer live, and hopefully folks are seeing the answers to the other questions that we've been answering during the webinar too. And we will be following up with some folks where there's just a little bit more follow-up and things that we need to look at before answering that. So first question for you, Elise, I want to throw it to you is, did you see any differences in the data by sector, for example, for arts organizations?
Thank you, Annie. So there's a lot of data here. As I said, we asked 63 questions, and there are a lot of different ways to really splice and dice the data to dig into trends and themes by organizational characteristics. So we do see differences, and we know that it can be really valuable to look by sector for things like planning and joint collective advocacy for a sector, for instance. In the report itself, we highlight a couple differences based on budget size, often, not sector specifically, but we did look across sectors. Arts represents, I think it was the second highest sector that responded to the survey. And when we look at arts organizations compared with those working with other sectors, there's a couple differences I'll highlight, but note this isn't exhaustive. The arts organizations that responded were more likely to serve regionally or locally compared to many of the nonprofits. Also, more likely to have smaller budget sizes. So it was around 85% or so that had budgets under $2 million, compared with about 58% of non-arts organizations. So when we looked at everybody else. Interestingly, they also more often reported working to build community wealth and also working to advance racial equity compared to non-arts organizations. And I will say also in looking at their revenue model, it looks like, which is consistent with anecdotes we hear working with many arts nonprofits, that many more appear to rely on funding from individual donors as part of their revenue model. It was almost 100% of arts nonprofits that said they get some of their revenue from individual donors, which was much higher than when we look at all other organizations. We saw that many arts organizations are less likely to receive federal funding, but we're a lot more likely to receive state or county or local funding, which we found interesting. And when we look, though, at some of those key financial indicators that I mentioned before, we see fairly similar rates of surplus and deficit, months of cash. In fact, when we look across all sectors, a lot of those trends related to surplus deficit and months of cash hold true. But a higher percentage did say that their grants have gotten smaller. So we know that looking by sector can be really valuable. I will make a plug for something Annie highlighted before, that there's a lot in the data, and we really want everybody to be able to use the data. So in the fall, we are going to be putting out a tool for everybody and anybody and everybody to use, where you'll be able to look at many of the survey questions and filter by by a couple of characteristics. So we'll be able to filter by geography, state, for instance, by sector. So for whoever asked the arts question, you'll be able to look at a lot more data comparing arts organizations to everybody else, or arts organizations to human services organizations. We'll be able to filter by budget size as well. And our hope is really that everybody can use this data, whether it is for your own planning. It should come out perhaps when many are developing their budgets, but also for advocacy efforts right now, which we know many are involved with. So hopefully that provided a little glimpse as to some nuance for arts organizations, perhaps reflective of arts organizations' experiences on the line, but a lot more to come in the fall when we share the data.
Great. Thanks so much, Elise. I'm going to toss one more question to Jen that came up early, was about the percentage of how many are able to pay their staff a living wage. And I think the question specifically is, what does it mean that only 41% of nonprofit respondents pay all full-time staff at a living wage? I think it's just understanding what that data point means.
Hi, thanks so much for the question. Thanks for all of the great questions that I see coming in. So what that means is that the rate at which these organizations are able to pay their other full-time staff is lower than what is considered a living wage for where their organization is located. And so it is part of the challenge that is connected to all of the funding challenges that we just talked about, that organizations are not in a position to pay all of their full-time staff a living wage.
Great. Thank you, Jen. I'm going to take one more question with the minute that we have left here. And I know other folks have questions as well that we will answer in follow-up. But I think there was a question about the racial identity of the leaders of the responding organizations. So I just want to see, Elise, if you could quickly answer that, just to be clear about who the responding organizations were.
Yes, for sure. So on the slide that Sha'Carri showed, we showed kind of a breakdown by anybody who selected one of those racial identity categories. We know there are a lot of folks that identify as having multiple races or ethnicities as well. So that slide actually, the percentage added up to more than 100% because people could select multiple categories. We also did look to see who identified as having kind of any people of color led category, which we identify what we mean by that in the report, versus those that selected kind of white led only and no other racial or ethnic category. It was 37% of organizations that responded that they identify with one of the people as being a person of color, at least one of those categories. 60% responded as being white-led and didn't select any other racial or ethnic categories. And then a couple of folks selected unsure or didn't choose to answer that question as well, which is why we have a couple extra percentage points. I hope that answers the question, and happy to follow up with whoever asked if they have additional questions.
Thank you, Elise. We do have about 5 or 6 more questions, and for folks on the line who are waiting, we will follow up with you. We want to honor that this webinar is supposed to end right now at 12 o'clock Pacific time. So if we could just put up the last slide, Michaela, Team NFF, that, we are really, again, so thankful for all the nonprofits that have responded to this survey. We know it's a very challenging time right now. We are hopeful that these recommendations can be put into action and that we can move forward together so that we can be able to get through this period of time that organizations are experiencing. Please follow us and follow us on email. We will send out this recording as well as the slides, and the actual PDF of the report can be found in the links. We will send out the links to the tools and resources that NFF provides on financial planning tools. And you will all, if you shared your email with us when you registered, will receive that as a follow-up email. And please follow us on LinkedIn and share these findings with your networks. Let us know if there's any questions. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you who joined today.